I mean, you could pop. Yes.
So I don't see too many of our staff on at the moment. I don't know exactly how many people we expect or whether we should hold on for a minute or two or proceed at 1:30 like planned. Wendy, you're there. There's Doug.
Yes, sorry, I just got on.
Okay. So I don't know how many people you're actually expecting and whether or not we should start on time at 1:30 or wait for a couple of minutes.
So we currently have 15 participants. I was just going to wait for Janice to come back on to confirm how many attendees confirmed with her.
We have 15 panelists here, one attendee. I'll have to check to see who accepted.
I texted this to Chair Jack, but just a reminder that, pardon me, Chair McNabb, pardon me, that Director Jack is on vacation, and so he's taking the day off. I don't know if we're supposed to say that it's his birthday or not, but and also Director Beckett has MLA and Minister Osborne visiting out in Bamfield today. So he and his alternate chose to stay out there, and so that's they send their regrets.
It certainly sets us in the field of priority, doesn't it? Okay, so do you think we should roll on here?
Mr. Chair, we have 17 people accepted the meeting, so I think we're good to go.
Okay. I'd like to call this meeting to order and recognize that we are meeting on the territories of the Tishat and the Hapetchizit First Nation, and that we honor that, and that we act respectfully. And so I'd like to. I don't think we've got Hapetchizit here, but we do not have Tishat that I can. Oh, Ken Watts is here. Sorry, he's hidden behind a Windows Update logo. Sorry. So we have Ken Watts from Tishat and Brandy Lauder from the things are moving all over my screen here. from Hapetchizit, and thank you very much for joining us. And so we'd like for an approval for agenda, please, or any additions. Director Shannon, second. Director Cote. Is there any additions? Okay, all in favor? Approved. Thank you. So we have the minutes of May 5th, 2021. If anybody's read those through, and like a motion to adopt those minutes.
I'll move adoption.
Director Minions and Director Bodner. Any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor? Approved. Okay, so now we have the question of the day. So that would be Mr. Holmes rolling along with that. You have 3 minutes, by the way.
Okay, well, I'll do the best I can with that time. I've got just a couple of words of introduction here, and of course, Terry and I and Wendy are happy to take any questions with respect to the staff report that's also a part of the agenda. So from staff's point of view, as long as the Echo Center continues to perform, there's no urgency for this conversation, but given the facility is 55-ish years old, we don't want to take too much for granted in terms of how much longevity we may be enjoying. But from our perspective, then the most important thing to do is get the community conversation going. And so the best conversation with the community will be an informed conversation with respect to what the next aquatic facility could or might be. So to inform that conversation, in our view, we need some current design options and some current costing, and to get informed feedback from the community. We need to understand the impact of what that costing is going to be on taxes, so people can weigh the taxes versus what they view the benefits of the pool. And we think that it's probably best to have, just like was contemplated in 2011, a number of different design options, again, with costing attached, so people can sort of say, well, how far can we go from a taxation basis vis-a-vis the benefits that will come out of one facility or another? So to get to that point, to get that information, we feel that the community needs to determine which electors will make the decision, which elected leaders will make the decisions regarding how to engage the public and what components will be a priority, et cetera. An important part of the question of who will make those determinations and how the elected leaders, which elected leaders will come together, is figuring out the part about the financial and operational risks. So, for example, in the current scenario, for the Echo Pool, the taxpayers of the city of Port Alberni bear all of the financial and operational risks, noting that, of course, some of the net costs are mitigated by contributions from the rural areas. So those rural contributions are fixed and therefore risk-free to the rural areas, leaving the taxpayers of the city with the risk. And there's historical reasons for that. In 1966, the Alberni Valley was at a very different place than what it is today. There's lots of industrial tax base, and as well as direct contributions from those industries that was very common in the province back in those years. And furthermore, like the ACRD was incorporated in 1966, and the population base of the rural areas was probably fairly sparse in those rural areas. And so that was then, and those conditions no longer exist. So looking at the last census, the Alberni Valley had about 25,000 people. Obviously, that's going to be changed, and we'll get those numbers in due course. But 30% of those people live outside the city. And so in staff's view, we cannot come up with a rationale for any recommendation other than the full sharing of risk throughout the Alberni Valley. It's a political decision, of course, but our recommendation is based on what we understand, the data, the use and enjoyment of these facilities, et cetera. And so that's what we've come up with. So we think the first question to resolve is the risk portion. And if that can get resolved, then the topics of net cost apportionment and governance should be addressed. The December 2019 facilitated session by Alan Nielsen only documented a couple of agreements about that. And I've got a note here, we're not to overburden the city or Area D in contemplating a sharing of the net costs, as well as an agreement by the parties that in the Alberni Valley, that both the capital and the operating costs should be shared by all of the AV jurisdictions. So that's not enough information to really drill down to talk about apportionment and that sort of thing. And again, apportionment needs to get answered after we understand who bears the risks, et cetera. So if an agreement is established on apportionment of net costs and governance, then as a group of elected officials, you can work as a collective with the community in presenting options and collecting public feedback. What I would say too is working as a collective is a very important endeavor, because if one party or another, if one jurisdiction or other decides to participate and then decides not to participate, all of the financial analysis changes with respect to those people who are still there and participating. So So as I mentioned in the report, it's not, this isn't the hard commitment time. There's no bylaws being drafted here, being created here, but eventually we need to have some assumptions on which to engage the community. And our recommendation is that the elected folks take those commitments to heart and really try not to change their position on that, recognizing, again, if you get the capital costs back in estimation or the operating costs and they're just too high, then that's a legitimate conversation to be had and talk about, what needs to happen with respect to course correction, if any. So the recommendations in the report are intended to be considered one at a time and in the order that they're presented. The fact that there's no mention of fixed contribution amounts by the municipal and rural AV jurisdictions is intended to communicate staff's recommendation that all parties share in the risks in accordance with whatever apportionment method is chosen. So that's probably more than my 3 minutes, Mr. Chair, but happy to take any questions with respect to any of that, including the report. Thank you.
Alrighty, question time. I got about 1,000, but somebody else jump in. Holy smokes, folks. Well, I mean, the chart that's in this staff piece that depicts the estimation of what the costs are going to be, it's on page 11. I mean, it's initially when I looked at this and saw my figure of $324,000 defined as maintenance costs, that was a pretty scary figure when my fire department's only $375,000. So, but then I was, Mr. Holmes explained that was actually capital cost and maintenance cost together. If I'm correct there, Mr. Holmes. Okay, so I mean, that kind of changes the profile of it, and then and this is the type of question I know I'm going to get from Beaver Creek folks is why is that so high? And I think it really has to be very, very carefully depicted what the figures actually mean, what they would compare to a referendum like we had with the arena, and what the tax consequences are going to be. The other piece that I had some discussion with Mr. Holmes about was the asset management piece of this. If the asset management input costs are going to be considering replacement of this facility in 20, 30, 40 years versus just asset costs for equipment and roofs and other things like that, then that completely changes the cost piece. And I personally don't think that our generation should be paying both for the new pool and for the next new pool. I think that there's a user divide there that some point in time my generation should stop paying and the next generation should start paying. So I'm thinking that that replacement cost of the whole facility shouldn't be part of our consideration for asset management within these calculations. And Mr. Holmes.
So we did have a good conversation about that this morning, and the ACRD has got just about all its first draft of its asset management plans completed. And one of the sentiments that is consistent in all of those plans is the amount that's expected to be required in the future to maintain levels of service is presented on a series of assumptions. But a very, very important conversation that needs to happen over the coming decades is what assumptions does the board want to operate under? Do we want to, for example, if we had an asset management program for the Echo Pool, what position would we want to be in right now, some 55 years after its construction and opening and after all these years of operations? And there's a lot of it is that there's no right or wrong answer for sure. That's a philosophical conversation about 55 years later. Would we want to have accumulated enough money to just go ahead and just rebuild one and just sort of pick the paint and design and go ahead with construction? Is that the position that we'd like to be in today, looking back over the last 55 years? And there's no right or wrong answer to that, because the whole question, as Chair McNabb has correctly introduced, is, where's the fairness line on the intergenerational equity? What is fair for us as taxpayers to pay for now versus people who haven't even been born yet, et cetera? And those are great conversations. What I would say is the presumption that we've got here is using 20 years of debt at roughly double the cost and then leaving a generous amount for operations. So we're hoping that the $4 million is, as an upper limit, provides for everything: debt, maintenance, operations, lifeguards, the works. It's very important to get more precision around these numbers, so we're not either doing a bait and switch with the electorate by bringing in a number that's too low, and then we go get the actual numbers and, oh, look, it's much higher, and versus going in too high and then saying, oh, well, we don't need all that money anyway, and then we've had a whole bunch of people saying that's too expensive, and in fact they'd have been quite correct. So we need to bring some rigor to these numbers. The other thing I would say too is there's money going out, as we talked about, a fixed amount by the rural areas and everything else by the city city taxpayers, to the extent that that there is subsidy, which there is, of course, over and above the gate fees, and that is not netted here. So this is the gross number of net taxation before we consider what's already being paid, et cetera, and that kind of thing. So yeah, the asset management is a big conversation that can happen over the decades. What I would suggest is a contribution to asset management during the 20 years of debt is probably something that doesn't really need to happen. I think that gets talked about more as the debt gets retired. But again, those are all policy decisions that the board would have to get involved in and come to some conclusion on.
Okay, other hands waving. Oh, Director Cote.
Thank you. Through the chair to all of the members here. This is a difficult conversation, and it's been ongoing for a long time. From Sproat Lake's position as having the high assessment base, we do definitely not want to see taxation coming that way. So to build the facility, I've always said that really it needs to be done similar to the aquatic or the arena, where it was a parcel tax. People could pay it up front or they could pay it annually. And I believe that is the way it needs to go forward for Sproat Lake to be a participant rather than assessment based. But the ongoing maintenance and the operational side, I think could be done differently. I think that's a different cost, and I'd really like to see the two separated. And I'll leave it at that, hear what other people have to say.
So I think that's a really good thought, quite frankly, that they should be separate figures. Anybody else? The other point that I noticed near the end of the explanation by staff was the concept that there should be one referendum for the whole of the service area, and I particularly am I'm not excited about that, that's for sure. I think that that's the time the rural areas are going to either buy in or not buy in, just like happened last time when Beaufort decided by vote that they wouldn't be participating in the arena. And I mean, I when we're going from not having a service to having a service, I think that the public really needs to be the driver on this, and all of the information that that's should be required for them to make a decision should be out there and understandable by the average person, and not having to be an accountant to figure it out. So I just having one referendum for the whole area could easily be swayed by, you know, 2 jurisdictions, and end up with everybody bought into something that they may not necessarily want. Yes, Director Minions. And Director Brodner next. Yay, there I got hands going. I knew if I entered controversy, I'd get something going.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank both of you for the comments you've made so far. Director McNabb, I think that the conversation around the asset management piece of this is really important. And I think to Doug's comments, it's not necessarily something we need to figure out in detail today, but I like the concept of, you know, potentially it not starting and while we're still paying off the debt. We expect this facility obviously to last a lot longer than it will take to repay the debt. So I think that's kind of almost a happy medium between some of the issues you were talking about. I think I just want to, I think from my perspective, I have almost a little bit of challenge with the comment that when we're going from not having a service to having a service, and I understand that you mean it as in the regional area doesn't currently pay into this service in this way, but I think that the Alberni Valley does have this service right now. The Alberni Valley, you know, no matter how you pay for it, has a pool, has access to a pool. I think we just all recognize it's not currently funded in a way that is equitable for all of the members of the Alberni Valley. So I think we almost just need to change that conversation a little bit, because it's not, you know, do we have a service or not have a service? We all have a service. We're going to improve it, and we're going to hopefully find a way that everybody ends up feeling positive about how they're contributing to it. But yeah, I appreciate the comments so far and looking forward to hearing from more of the rural directors.
Director Brodner.
Thank you. I really agree with what Director McNabb has said. I remember when that pool was first being put up, and for many years there was a lot of sourness within the community. They didn't like the way, I mean, things have changed, of course, but it just seemed like people did not have enough say in it, and they didn't like the way it was done. And through the years, too, there were some changes made where the rural people had to pay more money. And I really think that it's really important, and it should be made very clear that we have lots of input from the rural districts, because there's no need to have to. I know we're not going to make everybody happy, but I think there has to be an extensive effort put into hearing what the people in our constituents have to say. That's number one. Number two is Doug, you had mentioned that using the models that were set out in 2011, going by that, using that as a starter point, that was 10 years ago, you know, and once we start getting into this, it's going to be even another year or so, who knows. But by using that as a model and going by those finances, would that not really be like there would have to be a way to rate that, right? The places that ECHO may be used, the pool changing, if it was a different location, are those locations available now? I think there's a lot of things that if you're using that model, that have to be upgraded to today's standards. And I'm sure that's in the works, but those two things in particular, I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Mr. Holmes.
Well, I think going back on a couple of comments that the community conversation has to be very, very clear to the average person. So I've been involved in situations where people could bring in their property tax document and we'd be able to say in just a couple of minutes, so here's what the tax effect for your property, this specific property would be, and also put that up on the website, et cetera. So it really needs to be really, really clear and easy for people to understand exactly what the maximum tax effects could be on this. So everybody completely agrees on that, I believe. With respect to Director Bodner's questions and comments about the earlier documents, I think what I would say about that is we don't want to just pretend that stuff doesn't exist, because a lot of work went into the thoughts about that, et cetera. So that's a very important starting point. But at least one of those models, and I think maybe even two of them, talked about continuing to use the existing tanks. And I would say at 55 years old, I don't think that would be recommended by any engineer or architect, et cetera. I think we really need to start with fresh materials. So whether that's in the same location, so deconstruct and then reinstall, or different locations, et cetera, really has to be part of the conversations. And so the types of things we're talking about is really looking at the materials that are in hand and seeing what good ideas can be brought forward into this modern conversation 10 years later. And then talk about where are the possible areas and what makes the most sense, and get some order of magnitude costs for preferably about 3 designs that have, maybe a simpler model that is going to be the least impactful financially in terms of the smallest capital cost, and then maybe a couple of more features in a second model and a couple of more features again in a third model, et cetera, to really understand not only the capital but the operating costs as well of those 3 models. And that's a really technical exercise to go through, and we would want to put that in the hands of people who are experienced and knowledgeable in this area, so that when we put numbers in front of the public, they're pretty well researched by people who are familiar with how these things work. And just a simple example, a diving board just isn't the cost of the diving board. Your tank now has to be deeper, and your roof has to be a little bit higher potentially, which means you're handling and dehumidifying more air, and you're actually handling and chlorinating and heating more water. So there are operational impacts to just about every decision that's made. And modern standards also take lifeguard supervision very, very seriously with respect to different type of amenities. And so every time you add an amenity, you might be adding another person on the deck, et cetera. So all of these things need to be taken into account and need to be considered in bringing the calculations forward and understanding the numbers, because the last thing we want to be is too low on these things. We want to have a real conversation with the public, and they need to be able to understand what it means to them, both in what they imagine the use of the facility be and what it will cost as a maximum on their taxes each year.
So could I ask maybe Chief Councillor Lauder if she's got any questions or comments with regards to this, just from your point of view? You're muted. Okay, there.
Oh, sorry, I was eating a cookie listening to y'all. Well, we're just wondering, well, my first problem is I have an allergy to chlorine and I can't go near your pool. I can barely go into the museum half the times without a whole bunch of meds. But my kid goes there. Most of Hupetchsit go there. We try and book the place for most of our youth to go and families to go to have family nights. So it is a huge thing for Hupetchsit. I know Carolina has taken them down to Nanaimo, hit the wave pool, more stuff to do there, costs a lot more. But I know what it is to run one of those things. So I just look at it going, yeah, we don't have the tax base for it. They're not going to buy that. So my main questions are, where are you going to put a facility like this? And if you do have to put it in the regional district, is there going to be busing service for some of our members? Because they don't have vehicles, they don't have licenses, and they depend on the city buses to get around. there's a whole bunch of offsets that go to moving the pool. So, and then you have to bring out more services out there just to get the people to and from.
Okay, thank you. And Chief Councillor Watts.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, late lunch. Can't turn on my camera, but yeah, I think I attended a previous session. Would love to see this all come to fruition. I understand though the costs and the tax base that's required. And I've said before, I don't know how we can contribute in the future, but we definitely want to as a nation, because our nation relies so heavily on the current pool. And we've seen in Nanaimo the benefits of a facility and how well it can be run. And I don't know how the financials of that work for Nanaimo and the aquatic center, but a heavily used facility by many people. And I know we're not Nanaimo as well, but on behalf of SysShot, we're here to support, all of you and how we can help move this forward. And, when I saw the previous Canada Infrastructure Fund for community recreation, this is where I thought it definitely falls right in line with that. And it'd be great to secure a large grant from that pool. I'm hoping that they'll continue to keep that grant out as we come out of the pandemic and there's new investments in infrastructure. That seems like a very clear pooled opportunity. We've applied to the fund ourselves to build a new facility. Thanks to all of you, actually. I think the ACRD and the city both provided letters of support for that fund. It's community recreation, and I can't remember what the other term is. So yeah, hopefully we can make this happen. And I know there's still a lot of other information to come out. I'm glad Doug has shared. There's still a lot of information to, do research on, as well as bring back to you, and figuring out the costing. I totally understand. It must be a little worrisome for some of you as different regions that may not feel like it's being utilized enough. But I think if you build the right facility, that everybody would use it. And as I've said before, I don't think from a community perspective, I don't think you can not build something. When people move into a valley, they want to know that there's recreational opportunities, and knowing that they're there to make it more enticing, to make people want to move here. If we, for some reason, the current facility closes and we don't have anything, that's not a big enticement to want to move to Port Alberni and the valley and the region, not having those facilities. So a lot of things to consider, but we're just here to help and listen. And like I said, if there's opportunities for funding and grants, and if we can help support that, even if it's having more of a role, because as First Nations, we're able to tap into other funding as well. We're more than happy to support that. So on behalf of SysShot, thank you all for your work, and thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Okay, Director Haggard.
Thank you, Director McNabb. I'm one of those people, I'll probably never ever go to a pool. I'll never stick my big toe in it, but I realize the importance of having a pool in a community. For example, if you're a family, you want to know what amenities are available if you're considering moving to a community. I've had people call me to ask about the multiplex, to ask about minor hockey. So people do their research before moving into a new community. So it's very important that we continue to offer these amenities. So I think it's just a no-brainer that we move forward with getting a new pool, because our community will suffer if we don't have it. And Penny, I would like to say that your thought about payment based on debt, have a parcel tax and then operational taxes according to population. That was my thought this morning as well, have it broken down in two different amounts. To me, that sounds like the most fair way to everybody, the regional district and the city. But those are details that we just need to really work out and consider. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Corbeil's looking pretty quiet back there. I got you, Ron.
John, I'm just deep in thought, but it's all sounding positive. As you pointed out at the beginning, this pool is not going to last forever, and I can't see how the community of Port Alberni itself can afford on its own to build a new one. So I agree with pretty much everything that's been said, and as I say, this sounds positive, and it's overdue.
Councillor Paulson, and then Director Bodnar.
I don't have much to say.
Okay, next.
I'm excited that we're at this point today. And when we come out of today, we have some money set aside for consultants and consulting fees and stuff like that. And I'm looking forward to having that consultant do his work, bring back some information so we can actually do some concrete costing. I've been through this process before. I was 11 years with the Arena Society. And anyway, we're at the consultant's point of view. And with regards to 2011, there were 5 concepts put forward there. And I think we had it narrowed down to 2 at the time. Things have changed so drastically since 2011 to 2021. And I talked to some people that they're building a new pool in New Westminster, and it supposedly will be the first net zero pool in Canada, from what I understand. And so that's the difference in construction and design as well. There's efficiencies in the buildings and those sorts of things. And I concur with Councillor Haggard and Mayor Minions and other people that have talked. We may not use the facility ourselves, but we have to consider the overall health and welfare of the community as a whole. So I support, of course, I came from a recreation background, but I support these kind of developments in our community. When the consultant comes back and with some proposals, we can do some costing, and really we can get down to the nuts and bolts of deciding how we're going to pay for this, how costs will be allocated, and those sorts of things. But I'm really excited today that I hope that we're making a decision to move forward with consultation and move forward. So we've been talking about this for a few years, gang?
Director Bodnar.
Thank you. Another thing that I thought of that Mr. Holmes had mentioned, and I can relate to what he was saying, is when we're talking to the public, or whoever is going to be bringing this information to the public, should be able to explain to them in their language why a pool can't be, temperatures can't be raised in the pool, and those kind of things that you mentioned, Mr. Holmes. When I was running a home for the mentally challenged older adults, we found that this pool in Port Alberni, this was about 15 years ago, mind you, that the pool was too cold for them. So we used to have to take them down to Qualicum. So I went to Scott Kenny and I asked him, can we not just raise the temperature when these people are coming into the pool? And they said, it's not that easy, Diane. There's so many things involved. It's not just raising the temperature. It's all these other little components that have to happen. And it's either got to be one or the other. And the people that were using the pool at that time were people that were making laps, the younger people. So if something has to, and when you consider that the older people generation, 55% of them are in Port Alberni. And that might make a difference to them if they would know if there can be some changes made to the pool that would be right for them, especially for the seniors. So I think that's really important that some of those details are on how the pool is run is explained to the public. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yay, Director Shannon.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the yay. That's lovely. I just want to go back to a couple of points if we're looking how this has been set up by staff as the recommendations, or some points that we've talked about a little bit broader here. And when Doug introduced this, he made a comment about, I feel like we're in a little bit of a catch-22 when we're talking about the Alberni Valley participants, and we're kind of basing this, figuring out costs per area, and then you're you're committed, but you're not committed till we're set to establishing the service bylaw, because at that time, at a referendum, which I 100% agree with John McNabb that it should be by individual area, that if it's a no-go for one area, then I feel a little bit like tentatively, yes, I agree. But at the same time, without those numbers and this community involvement, I find it a little bit hard. It's almost a little bit odd when we haven't gone to the public with some of this stuff, with some hard numbers, but we're saying we need somewhat of a commitment. Is this making sense? Just to kind of address that, I understand that thought, but at the same time, I don't want it to sound like I'm saying yes when I totally agree that this is for investigative purposes. I just want that to be very clear that we're doing this for this feasibility study, and we're not saying we're doing it as step one and you're stuck in it. If you want to elaborate, or if I misinterpreted your comment, I just want to make sure that that's clear.
Okay, Mr. Holmes and then Director Cote.
So, Mr. Chair, I think that Director Shannon has articulated the conundrum perfectly. It is really a difficult thing to go to the public and say, we've got an estimation on say 3 different models. We've got the estimated capital cost. We think it'll know how much it'll cost to run it. Based on that, here's what the effect will be on you. We can't give them the answer, here's what will be effect on you, unless we know how many people are paying for it and on what basis. It's impossible to do that. Similarly, staff is of the opinion that if we go to the public and say, well, can you imagine the table that would be if we said, well, if we have 4 participants and we do it on this basis, it'll cost that. But if we have 5 participants and we do it on that basis, it'll cost that. But if we go back and do it on 4 participants and we have this allocated on this different basis, it'll cost that. So what's really, really needed in order to have an informed conversation with the public is for the elected leaders to really make some preliminary decisions and commit to those decisions to say that I can't really decide and vote in favor of anything until we've heard from the public. But I can vote in favor of a certain set of conditions in order to get that conversation to the public. And what the directors, in our view, have to conclude upon is a few important assumptions, and they're difficult. We don't take it lightly. We've talked about this an awful lot trying to figure this out, about what would make the most sense, what would honor the conversations that have happened before today with respect to rural areas that in the Beaufort that have, a farm that has 6 titles. Well, then a parcel tax is very difficult if you've got 6 titles on what looks like one farm. And what Director Cote has said about the property values at Sprout Lake, that's really, really important in order to make this appealing for electors. In staff's view, the very best way to proceed with this for the community is as one referendum. And we say that because if it's separate referendums and one area doesn't go forward, then the remaining areas aren't getting what they voted for. And these are long, complicated conversations. So that's not to say that after the community conversation closes, that any director in particular is tied to these things. I mean, that's a conversation that you amongst yourselves have to come to terms with and come to some conclusions on. But this conversation illustrates how important it is to try to reduce the number of moving pieces to a minimum number before the community conversation begins. Because otherwise, the thing that you're talking about keeps moving. How much it costs keeps moving. Who pays keeps moving. And that if it keeps changing like that, I don't know how the public can trust what it is they're talking about and what will be the outcome if it gets supported. So unfortunately, that's just the harsh reality of the nature of these conversations. And so I'm not saying for a moment that makes it easy. And I'm not saying for a moment the recommendations that we've put down are the answer. This is an important conversation that has to happen amongst this committee, and so that we can get the community conversation started, because that's where that's the really valuable part of it, is to hear from what the public thinks that they would benefit this community the best, all things considered. So that's really what we're trying to do in introducing this, and we're trying to break it down to as small as bites as possible. And that's why the risk conversation is really important, first of all. Right now, we've got a situation where one of the participants, representing in the last census about 70% of the valley's population, bears all of the risk. Is that the model that should go forward in the future? And we've provided our technical response to that. But that's really, in our view, the very first conversation that has to happen. And if you come to the conclusion that we've come to, then it's now time to talk about, okay, well, how do we share the net costs? And, we can prepare as many analysis as you'd like. We didn't prepare a parcel tax because we understood that was a kind of a showstopper for Beaufort. And so, but we are happy to prepare any analysis that this committee would want, and come back to as many meetings as are needed, because it's really important that this group is comfortable and cohesive before the community conversation begins. I hope that helps.
Director Cote first, and then Mayor Mendes.
Thank you. I don't really feel like I agree with the process that staff are bringing forward. I'd like to know how other communities have gone through this process, because I'm sure that we're not the first one here trying to create this service. I'd like to know some information on how the arena process went. Did they have the cost of building it up front, and then they went to referendum? Right now, we have no cost. I'm not willing to commit Sprout Lake residents to this formula at the moment, but I do want to participate in a process where we find out what the community wants in the facility, and get the cost there. And I think that that's a better way of coming from what they want to asking them to pay for something that to begin with, and then providing that information as to what it is they're going to get. Sprout Lake, right now, our taxation, we pay almost over $115,000 to parks. Our fire department was over 500,000 and is going up, I think, quite a bit next year. So we've got those considerations to take into as well. Nobody participates in those services with us for our parks, and we don't want anybody to provide extra cost. But we have to really be considerate of what we're going to be doing in the future with participation in a facility like this. So I would really like to know about the arena specifically, how that process went, and how the referendum went. Was the referendum for all of the valley or individual areas? I think it's all quite important as to moving forward.
I got you, Ron.
Thanks.
Director Minions, and then Director Paulson.
Thank you. I just a couple comments. I think I don't think we should look too much to the past at what we have done to determine, what we should do for moving forward. Our communities have changed, the needs of our communities have changed, the expectations of people, residents of the regional areas, certainly, and certainly the expectations of members of the city of Port Alberni, and what their government will provide to them. The expectations have changed for sure, as the world is a changing place. I think it's certainly, I'm sure Ron could probably provide some context as to what, or some background as to what the arena process was, but I think it's likely not it's not what is being suggested today, and probably for good reason. It's a different model, and it's a different ownership model and operation and everything else. And I think we almost have to take a bit of a step back from this conversation around some of the details and get back to the conversation about what do we see as a fair system for moving forward. I really liked the suggestion earlier from Director Cote that we look. I think I'm hearing a recognition that we all expect, we all think that the most equitable way is that we fund this together, both operationally and construction. But it's how do we look at that, and of course, will our areas approve? I really liked the concept that we maybe fund the construction differently in a different format and a different structure than we do the ongoing operation. I think there's a lot of basis for that, and it makes sense, and it might make people more comfortable as well. I think my question, Doug, is does every area have to like if parcel tax is uncomfortable for Beaufort, but assessment-based is uncomfortable for Sprout Lake, could we determine almost portions, and then each area within that could decide how that portion is split between their area, if that makes sense, for the construction? And maybe that's too complicated for today, but I think if we just know we can get some of those figures, it might help this conversation along. We don't necessarily have to decide those things now. We just have to recognize that we can get the information that we're looking for. And again, that, I think the big thing today, in my opinion, is the recognition that we are looking to move forward with this, working together jointly.
So I see Director Jack, if there's a birthday candle raised, he's looking to talk. So go ahead, Director Jack, older Director Jack.
Yeah, 40 years old.
Hey.
So I think we do have to have that conversation about what kind of formulation that we're willing to look at, because I think the conversation should be about how do we want to pay for things, because that's the first thing a lot of folks are going to think about first, regardless of whether or not what's on the table for the pool. And then once that method has been discussed, we should have a values-based kind of discussion about what we want or want to see, rather than just going, okay, we're going to pay this much, whatever's the cheapest. Like, what do we actually need or want, and go from there. In terms of that first question, this is reminding me of discussions that the Monos First Nations and potentially the Nuu-chah-nulth. So maybe Ken can chime in here with anything he knows, but we have used different models of determining how much a nation would pay into a given kind of joint endeavor. And because we have such different population and development models for each of the nations, it would usually be some combination of population and base rate. So this sounds like it would be the same kind of combination of parcel and assessment. I don't know what that looks like, but the math shouldn't be that difficult, because our finance folks are sophisticated enough to figure that out. I think it just comes down to finding a way that will please a small community or a small population community versus a high assessment community, and so on and so forth, and go from there. So I think rather than stating positional stuff for our voters back at home, we should be talking about now what can yes actually look like, given what we're having a discussion about, what we've mentioned already. And I think there's openness to a discussion. And I think we've all kind of made our announcements that we're going to guard the taxpayers. So that's a checkbox now. That's done. We can communicate that from now on. What does it actually look like? What does the combination of parcel and assessment look like? And go from there. Because I think that's the biggest hump we need to get over. But yeah, thank you.
Mr. Holmes, did I see your hand up, or were you batting flies out of the air?
I was just going to say that there's the Local Government Act provides a fair bit of flexibility in terms of preparing ways in which costs can be allocated. And so that we can get into that detailed conversation if the committee started coming up with different ways to look at these.
Dr. Paulson.
Just in response to Director Cote's some of the questions that were presented, the multiplex process was an 11-year process, and I certainly hope we don't take 11 years to get to there. But yes, we went through a consulting process over a number of years, and we actually chose a design and came up with concrete cost. Once we had the concrete cost, we developed 2 different taxation systems, and actually many of you may recall that the multiplex went to 2 referendums, failed in the first one, and the first one was based on land improvements only. And we heard loud and clear as a society that, particularly places like Sprout Lake and stuff didn't feel that was equitable. So the second referendum was based on a parcel tax, and certainly we lost Beaufort in that process. But I really think it's critical that we go through this consultant phase, that we get to 1 or 2 combinations of a design where we have more concrete costs, and then we can actually break down these different systems. And I know that staff, that was in 2020 roughly, or year 2000, and I know staff will come back with some things that we can do differently today than we did 21 years ago. But that's kind of a history. I sure hope this situation does not take us 11 years like the multiplex did. But I really think we need to get to a point where we, through consultants and through public consultation, find out exactly what the public wants in a design, come up with maybe 2 designs, and we have concrete costs for those designs, and then we can figure out the exact costs to each municipality within our valley. And like I say, I'm just really thrilled today that I hopefully at the bottom of the line there's the last motion that we move forward and get the consultation thing going. It may come back and that pool's out of our realm, and we may just say, look, we've done our due diligence, and we say no. I think we'll do our due diligence and say yes, but that's a little bit of the historical on the multiplex, and I certainly don't mind off camera being a bit of a consultant or a resource person on the multiplex. And Mayor Minions, I agree. I think in today's world, there's probably some pretty imaginative ways that we can get this thing done. And Councillor Watts, it's been a while, but I know that the Canadian government introduced some grants actually that are specific for recreation replacements. And it was really introduced to help replace the aging ice rinks across Canada, through the prairies, through rural Ontario and Quebec. But I think pools would probably apply there. And it was pretty aggressive. There was a lot of money available. I hope it's still there. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. I really think we need to get to design and concrete costs before we can say, this is what the city is going to pay, this is what Beaufort could pay, and have a couple of options out of that. So just some random thoughts, and thanks for listening.
Okay. Anybody else looking to question? Yes, Director Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody's comments. I know I'm going to have issues if we talk about a parcel tax. I think you all recognize that too for Beaufort. And so I just want to, be very clear about that, if we're going to talk about, like if I'm looking at the second recommendation where we talk about proposed service be defined as, and if we're saying we might want to have some more information there, That, I mean, I agree with the, let's do a study and see what it's going to cost. I just, I'm uncomfortable right now with Beaufort saying, yes, we're going to do this, and then feel like we're locked in, even though we're saying you could come out of it. Because I think, and I know we're back to that like chicken and egg thing. And we've talked about, like Shari mentioned, we've got changing demographics and stuff, but I do still hear in my area quite a bit. This is why I moved to Beaufort. This is why I'm not in the city. This is why I'm not closer to the city. And I have to be that voice for them, and I need to point that out. And there's comes back to the comments of, I would rather pay a higher user fee when and if I want to use a service, because that's why I live in a rural area. And I do worry that if we are looking at a referendum that's for the whole valley, that a small area like mine can get railroaded into it when really that's not what they want. So I just want to be very conservative here and speak that. I know we're not talking about put areas, but those are the things I hear. And I think it's important that everybody understands that. And that's where my hesitancy is coming from, where we're saying, yes, it should be the valley to do the study. And I get that, but know that historically Beaufort has pulled out of things because of it. It was a parcel tax, or it was just not wanted. So I have to be prepared that that's what I may hear from my area.
Next. Well, was that your hand up, Director Cote? No?
Yes. Yes. So from what I'm hearing from everybody, it sounds like we all want to move forward with exploring what a pool would cost. There's a community, I can't remember which one it is, that recently withdrew from building their pool because the affordability. I know that Viral has stepped back from a couple of our proposed new library builds. One of the estimates went up significantly, like probably $6 million more. So we've stepped back. So right now, the cost of building a pool is going to be astronomical. And honestly, I don't think it's fair to all the participants if we get to the final start line to build, and it's like, and there's areas that aren't going to be participating, which increases the cost for the rest of the people within the service. So when that happens, I'd rather start off with saying, no, let's just say that I'm not going to be participating, but I want to, but just because I don't want to put that burden, if it does come down to it, that the community doesn't want it because the cost is too high or whatever, I don't want to put the burden on the other participants, because that would be really not fair. So that's why I'm wanting to see what the cost is, and more so what the community wants, because I think that if you see that shiny new pool, you're going to want it if you can see what it is, rather than talking about finances and not really knowing what you're looking at. So that's why I support going forward with looking at different options for this facility going forward before we start cutting it up, but and maybe different options in cost wise. And you know, with the libraries, that you know, what we've looked at in the past was Viral's asked the community, what do you want in libraries? And they want everything. They want the premier, and then we look at what we can afford to provide. So I'd really like to see it go that way, but I'm only one vote. Thanks.
Dr. Shannon, Mr. Holmes.
Thank you. I essentially agree with Director Cote. We budgeted money aside to do this study, and I don't know if we can be a little bit more vague or give ourselves some more flexibility to do the study without being as specific with our resolutions. Because another thing that worries me when it comes to money wise is we're coming out of COVID, and we know that there's a lot of people struggling. Some trades in some places are doing awesome, but we haven't mentioned it yet. And I just want to make sure that that's perhaps part of how the consultant works, if we're taking that into consideration. And I'm sure the public's going to give us their thoughts one way or another, but I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on the timing of this, essentially. And speaking of timing, when we get to it, the thoughts of running this along with elections next year, like everybody's kind of 2 cents on that part. Thank you.
Mr. Holmes.
Well, Mr. Chair, I guess a couple of things. One thing I would say about COVID is we're talking about an asset that would, or an amenity, I guess is probably a better word for it, that will serve the community. If history is any indication, 5 or more decades, there are going to be several cycles of economic boom and economic bust, et cetera. This isn't a conversation. It's not that I disagree with the comment about construction costs and all that kind of stuff. Those are all factual, of course. There's nobody disputing that. I certainly don't dispute that. And the elected officials would want to pick their time in terms of whether they think it's the right time to actually construct. But this is going to be many, many months, if not years, in getting to that point. So I would look at sort of the micro cycles that affect this as less important until and unless it's time to actually start raising debt and constructing. So that's just an observation. But really, the reason I put my hand up is Director Cote said we'd like to talk about sort of what we're building before we decide who participates. Staff needs to take direction from somebody, and that somebody needs to be the people who have put some commitment forward to this process. So the commitment comes before the direction. Otherwise, we don't know who to take direction from. So I know that doesn't make the decision easier, and it does highlight the conversation earlier about this being a chicken and an egg. But if we're taking direction from a group that includes somebody who's not planning to participate, then I don't know if that voice belongs there. That's the nature of the regional district system, is that if you're going to be participating in this conversation, then the jurisdiction really needs to have some commitment towards it. And even though it's not a permanent commitment, it's not a betrothal until the establishment bylaws are voted on, it still needs to be some good faith saying we're going to, we plan to be here, and a bunch of data is going to come, and we haven't heard back from the community, but we don't know what to take to the community until the directors give us some direction, and we don't know which directors to take direction from yet. So that's the nature of our challenge right now.
So the one thing that I see as kind of a hurdle is actually moving towards establishing the service establishing bylaw, because that's the piece that in my area has been the one that has been most negatively talked about. Is not that we're not willing to participate in the capital funding of the project, but that we're going to be locked into being ongoing management component of the project. And So I think that that's really something that we need to vet with the public and in each area and get the consensus from the public that they either want to go in that direction or they want to go in the direction that we previously were, which is still doable, but just needs adjustment. And so, I mean, I think it's important that we kind of move forward with that discussion with the public, as in bullet one. I mean, I think the motion, the second motion, is really something that I think we need to kind of rethink maybe a little bit before we actually move it, because it's going to make a difference in acceptance in several of the rural areas. It might need to be worded differently, that, or more options to it. And I'm not even sure about the next motion as far as setting the number of votes. I don't know what that's based on, and we haven't discussed it. But so the rest of it kind of is, I think, what everybody's sort of talking about. You know, getting a consultant and having some kind of idea what the plan's going to look like, and so forth. So I think we're sort of in general concurrence with that. But so that's my thinking. I don't know if anybody wants to start waving motions around, but it might be a good time. Director Paulson.
Well, I kind of concur with Chair McNabb on this one. It's the last two motions that have my attention on this report, and Mr. Holmes, maybe we take some wording from the first three motions and really zero in on the last two motions into who's going to help pay for during the consulting phase. And not until we finish that consulting phase do I think that rural areas or rural districts can commit to establishing a bylaw, a service bylaw for the overall project. We may at the end of the consulting phase say, we're not moving forward or we're not comfortable, but you know, maybe we need to define who's going to pay what through the consulting phase. And I think we've already done that. We've allocated the 100,000 and we've allocated how much each group is going to pay out of that 100,000. But I just, maybe that's the way we need to go, is just kind of define the consulting phase for now. And I realize the second motion says investigating the service prior to drafting the service established bylaw, but maybe some directors aren't comfortable with that point right now without some more concrete costs. But once again, I'm just spitballing, and I would really like to get through this consultant phase and public consultation phase before anybody, whether it be Beaufort or Sprout Lake, makes a commitment to the overall funding of the project. But, anyway, that's kind of my feeling right now. I'm just really excited to get to this consulting process. Let's get through that. Public consultation is part of this process, and then come back to the board and say, are we going to do it, and how are we going to do it in detail? Okay,
So that's kind of where I'd like to get to, is what are we going to do with the motion and how are we going to do it? Paraphrasing Director Folsom. Yes, Ms. Vaughn.
I wanted to point out that for the proposed Alberni Valley Aquatics Facility proposed service that we included in the budget for that 100,000, the participants are City of Port Alberni, Beaufort, Sprout Lake, Beaver Creek, and Cherry Creek. So I just thought I'd clarify that.
Okay, anybody got any motion ideas? Director Holmes.
Well, I can't move the motion, but I feel like that some of the spirit of what we tried to draft has been lost here, because in each of these motions, it's really for the purpose of investigating. It's talking about, let's try to isolate as many variables as possible. Let's try to have as few moving parts as possible for the purposes of a community discussion. what we fully expect is as this goes out to the public, there'll be a number of warts that are discovered in some part of this whole process. And what I fully expect based on my work with you over the last number of years is that you'll listen to those comments from the public and that adjustments would be made accordingly. So that is the spirit that these are drawn in. It's not, it's you know, I feel like in drafting some of this that I've maybe frightened you a little bit by saying, you know, don't take your commitment lightly. At the same time, of what we've also tried to say is the feedback loop from the public is the most important part about this. And the clearer we present the model, the clearer the feedback from the public is going to be. If we have so many variables going to the public, then we've got really nothing that we're asking them to speak on specifically. And so if a particular cost allocation method is presented and through that conversation, we're hearing a lot of problems with that in one area or the other, you know, the board is within its ability to say, well, let's put some alternatives there. Based on what we've heard so far, what would a second or third option look like in this area? So what we're really trying to do is get to the point where it isn't a legal commitment. But the way we do business in a regional district is create service establishment bylaws. That's the mechanism with our enabling legislation. That is to say that there are certain steps we have to take in order to be enabled. One of those very important steps, the most important step, is going to the public and getting their permission based on a series of criteria that will be articulated by you as elected officials. And so what we're saying is we can't get to that point yet until we really give a flavor of what that looks like to the public. And if there are too many variables, they won't be able to clearly respond to you. So again, our recommendation is really to consider these resolutions, recognizing that the point of these resolutions is to get to the community conversation, spend the money that's already been allocated by the participants as articulated by Ms. Fong, to get the expert information to have an informed conversation with the public. That's the purpose of these things. It doesn't tie anybody to anything yet. We're just trying to say, don't take that commitment lightly because this commitment takes us through the community conversation. Part of that community conversation might be that one area or another cannot be here. And then you guys will have to talk about that. So I just wanted to just remind you that this is not the last stop.
Well, folks. Director Bodner.
Thank you. To the chair, Mr. Holmes, I just want to clarify what you said. What I was hearing is that we should be going to the public first to find the flavor of this, whether they want the pool or not, as opposed to getting a consultant with that money that we already have. Is that what you're saying?
Quite the opposite, Mr. Chair. What I think is we need to clarify and get some specific information before going to the public, so the public can be reacting to very specific set of parameters. And what I've learned about working with all of you is that you're going to listen to the public and weigh all of the information you get. And from that response from the public, I virtually guarantee that the product that you put forward initially will get tweaked before anything goes to a referendum.
So
either a little tweak or a great big tweak. I don't know the answer to that, but we need to get something specific in front of them first, is what I'm suggesting.
Okay, so therefore, what Director Paulson has said seems to sound like a good idea. That's something that's concrete. The money is there. We can get some information and then take that to the public.
The difficulty with skipping right down to the latter resolutions, the difficulty with that is if somebody says, how much will it cost me? The best answer you're going to be give them is, well, it depends. It depends on who's going to participate. And what I would say to you is, if I were asking that question, a better answer would be, well, here's the assumptions we've made. And based on those assumptions, which are not set in bylaws yet, based on those assumptions, your portion of this will be this much per year. And that's a good answer. That's a specific answer. This particular program, with a wave pool, without a wave pool, with a slide, without a slide, whatever it is we bring forward, will cost this much in taxation. I think we need to get to that specific, that level of specificity, and the only way we get to that is if we make some initial decisions and assumptions with respect to who's participating and how we share the costs, and the public will react to all of those things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
Thanks.
Director Minions.
I think these are hard decisions to make because there's going to be no perfect formula that works for all of us. And at the end of the day, our goal here, our common goal, is to try to put this forward to the public in a way that they can decide if it works for them or not. It's our role to make these initial decisions and assumptions to be able to get the public some answers. It's the public's role to determine if what we've put forward to them works. Or in the case of the multiplex, it didn't work, so they voted it down and they went back to the drawing board. That could happen here as well, but we need to be able to take this step to pass these motions so that we can start the work so that we have something to put in front of the public. When I talk to members of the public about this, what I hear is the frustration that we haven't started engaging them yet. People want an opportunity to be heard on this issue, whether they're for or against the pool. And these motions get us to the point where we can start that conversation. The public is going to decide if we spend the money or not, but it's their right to have the opportunity to have the conversation. And I think we need to pass these motions in order to give them that ability to be a part of the conversation. So I'm going to just start reading motions. I will, if that's okay. I will read the first one. So that the Alberni Valley and Bamfield Services Committee recommend that Board of Directors that the participants of the Alberni Valley Aquatic Facility proposed service be defined as the City of Port Alberni, Electoral Area B, Beaufort, Electoral Area D, Sprout Lake, Electoral Area E, Beaver Creek, and Electoral Area F, Cherry Creek, for the purpose of investigating the service prior to drafting the service establishing bylaw.
I second that motion.
Okay, on the motion, any comments? Director Cote?
Thank you. By bringing these forward, it sounds like the city is driving this. And I'm feeling a little uncomfortable about that. I guess it's because history says that there was one or two circumstances in the past where areas were included and were not favorable in the vote in the end, and were roped into service in the past. So I'm just very cautious about moving forward. I do want to move ahead, and I do want to get the consultants going, but I'm just feeling that this was a recommendation coming from the Alberni Valley and Bamfield Services Committee. So why can't they just be controlling the study? Thanks.
Mr. Chair, if I can also comment, Councillor Corbeil, because this is an AV committee, he's not a director, he won't be able to second that motion.
It wasn't Councillor Corbeil, it was Director Paulson. Seconded it, I think. That's the seconder I had.
Okay,
Okay,
sorry, that's not what
sorry, it's not right?
yeah, that's not what I heard, but that's fine if Director
Oh, okay,
Paulson.
that's partly because Councillor Corbeil is on my far right and Director Paulson's right in front of me. Sorry, that's probably how that happened.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Chair, just to respond to Director Cote's question and observation, there's no way for us to put something in front of the public that gives them the tax effects until assumptions are made as to who's participating and how the costs are allocated. And so if that's the case, then I don't know what we're bringing forward to the public, is what I would say.
So in my weak mind assessment of this, I mean, I think if we highlighted for the purpose of investigating, I mean, that's what I'm looking at, is that it's for the purpose of investigating the service prior to drafting the service file. And I'm okay with that, because prior to that, up to that date, I've got the ability to say, this isn't going to work for Beaver Creek. So, I'm good with that move going forward with that verbiage in there, that it's for the purpose of investigating and for the proposed service. So that part works for me. Director Shannon.
Thank you. I will echo that. If we can make it really clear, whether that's bold or underlined, that we're here for the purpose of investigating. And I think this conversation that we're just having right now as elected officials and bringing our concerns forward, our excitement forward, we're getting the gist of kind of where everybody's at. And I understand the city's excitement and the drive to get this forward. And I know that city officials here are understanding where the rural's coming from. So I know we're making assumptions, but I know that we're all knowledgeable with each other of what may happen down the road. So for the purpose of investigating, yes, I agree, because I know, Doug, we have to have assumptions before we can put numbers forward. But as I mentioned before, if this was coming down to, we had to make a decision today, I couldn't make it for Beaufort right now, but just for investigating purposes, as long as that's very clear, then okay.
Anybody else? Okay, on the motion, all in favor? Looks like it's carried. Opposed, sorry. Opposed? Anybody opposed? Nobody opposed. Carried. Okay, so you're reading motions. That was your commitment, Marilyn.
I guess I'm reading all emotions then. Sure. That the Alberni Valley and Bamfield Services Committee recommend to the Board of Directors that the appointment method of the Alberni Valley Aquatic Facility proposed service be defined as net costs based on converted improvements only for the purpose of investigating the service prior to drafting the service establishing bylaw.
Director Paulson, second. And on this one, hands in the air. Comments? Dr. Bodner? No. So, I mean, personally, I think that we need to, I know we need a basis, but I'm wondering if we should have more than one basis.
I think that's a good idea.
Director Cote, that was Director Jack that spoke up to that. Director Cote?
Thank you. I don't think it's going to be favorable when you have the costing out with like that. And I think that that's something that needs to be discovered before it's released to the public with different options.
Well, I mean, in the discussion we had, it appeared that different electoral areas have different problems with each of the assessment ways, and investigating whether or not we can actually have one funding method in one area and one funding method in another area that may be better received. I mean, that's what I'm kind of talking about. So Mr. Holmes.
Well, Mr. Chair, I think that this particular item could go to the next meeting and get passed over for the time being. I mean, if the last resolution, if confirmed by the board, has all of those jurisdictions participating in the conversation. So now we know who we're working with and who's working together at this particular point in the process. I think those same parties could come to another AV and Bamfield committee meeting in the future to talk about both the apportionment, the method, like the method of sharing net costs, as well as governance. And those things ought to be somewhat linked. So I think the next two resolutions could be parked until a further meeting, and get into those things in detail in further discussion. Because I think that there's been a couple of questions and comments made here today that would make me want to put my heads together with Wendy and Terry and possibly our legal advisors and open up the Local Government Act and talk about what might the possibilities be with respect to having different methods in different areas, et cetera. And got a few questions about that. I don't know exactly what the answers are until they're researched. So that's just a suggestion that the next two could be parked for the time being, and then the two after that, with respect to getting the process of procuring experts for estimating and designing and communications continue.
I guess we don't actually have to worry about the cost allocation until we find out what the cost is either, really.
Affirmative.
Director Jack has his hand up, I think.
I do.
Okay.
I was just going to reiterate the idea that we just need to communicate more actively as directors what our intentions are going into these discussions, and that's what they are. And not be intimidated by what we're talking about here, because everyone's just kind of airing their own positions at this point and interests, and we'll arrive at a situation where a decision can be made. And so in the interim, I think the advice of talking about the process and the pool and all this kind of thing really does start with it depends, and we're going to have to wait and see what the information gives us. I'm wondering though, Mr. Chair, if we could in this motion make some sort of amendment to include more avenues of investigation, or can this be interpreted as something where we're going to do that anyway?
Well, I kind of like Mr. Holmes' idea of parking this until we have a little better understanding of what our options are. And so I don't know if that's okay with the mover and seconder if we look at deferring this until the next AV meeting.
I'm supportive of deferring, especially if we could bring back some more specific numbers around what different options would look like at the next meeting.
So
Director Paulson, sorry.
I concur with that. And actually, after the first motion is passed, I think it gets us down to the last two where we can actually move forward with some concrete movement. And the second and third motions, I agree. Maybe we need a little more info and refining of the wording and stuff. But I'm just excited to get down to the who's participating and the last two motions. And it gives us an opportunity just to let's move forward.
Who's my parliamentary wisdom here? Wendy, where are we going with this? You there? Yep.
Yes, I'm here.
So how do I do?
So we have a mover and seconder for the second motion. Is it being withdrawn then, or?
Can we just?
Well, we're gonna bring it back at the next AV meeting. So are we deferring it, tabling it, sending it to Mars, or what?
Yeah, we can defer it to the next meeting. Which meeting, an AV meeting or?
Yes.
Yes, that would be
Okay.
a good motion.
Okay, I think that's what we've moved. So all in favor of deferring this section to the next AV meeting? Anybody opposed? Carried. Moving right along with reading.
Oh, yeah, that's me again.
Yeah.
That the Alberni Valley and Bamfield Services Committee recommend that the Board of Directors direct staff to undertake the process to secure a consultant to proceed with the feasibility study, including location, conceptual design, capital costs, and operating costs of a new Alberni Valley aquatic facility building off of the City of Port Alberni's 2011 report. Building off of the City of Port Alberni's 2011 report.
Seconder, Director Paulson and Director Cote, are you speaking?
Yes, thank you. So can you explain, please, building off the City of Port Alberni's 2011 report? What that consist of? We're not going by that. That would just be background. Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Chair, essentially exactly that. It's just background. So a fair bit of work went into looking at various options, et cetera. Some of the graphics show different components that might be desirable in the community, et cetera. And so in some ways, this is a symbolic piece on the document, because a lot of people that I've talked to in the community say, well, gosh, all this work's done already. We've got all this in hand. And so some of it may or may not be relevant, but the point of the matter is that to recognize that it's not just getting forgotten about, that it'll be looked at, and whatever design recommendations come out of consultants for location, for components, et cetera, that's what this committee is going to adjudicate and wrestle with.
Director Cote, you're off. Okay.
Thank you. So I just have concerns that that is the City of Port Alberni and not the regional district and not the rural areas. And it is 10 years old. So it would be really good to remember that we have that information, but I don't want to go by that plan going forward. I think that $100,000, we should be able to come up with a new plan. And that's what I'm sort of hoping to get is input from the community for buy-in, especially from the rural areas. Because I think it's important that they have a connection to a new facility with their own ideas. Because it is going to drastically affect our taxation. So I want this to be a success. So just don't want to be falling back on this old plan. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, it'd be perfectly appropriate to remove that last phrase as well.
I mean, personally, I think that to me is cost effective, quite frankly. I mean, that work has already been done. There may be hallmarks within that we need to reckon with, and so I wouldn't like to think that we were going to ditch all of that work and not even consider it. I think we need to look at the history of that and the relevance and decide on what, how to move forward. But that's my thinking. How about anybody else? Dr. Cote.
Thanks. I don't mean to be picking this all apart, but I just don't want to just be going forward with the old report. I think that we need to definitely, there's got to be some value in it, but I really want to see a new plan.
I think that's what building off means, in my mind. I mean, it's not using the report, establishing that as the method forward, is taking that report and gleaning what's good out of it and throwing the rest of it away. In my mind.
Preconceived, but
anybody else? Treasurer Shana.
Thank you. I'm just looking for clarification on the resolution that we're voting on now. This is taking into consideration some of the more specific points that we've got starting on page 8 of step 3 of Doug's report, where we're just getting into 3.1 staffing, operating, proposed location, and then 3.4 is administrative matters to be tentatively settled before community conversation. So just to be clear that this is kind of what we're looking at now when we're talking about administrative processes. Or is that we're just kind of voting on the general right now?
We're voting on the second bullet from the end.
Yeah, no, I understand that, because we're going to undertake the process to secure a consultant, or am I jumping ahead with step 3 is kind of where I'm looking at step 3 on page 8 is direct staff to prepare process documents and procure consultants, because that's kind of broken down a little bit more on that page. And if we're just more focusing on procuring the consultant, if we've skipped a couple of resolutions, just for my mind, what we're, sorry, if that's confusing or not, sorry.
This is a wee bit. Mr. Holmes?
This resolution is really about the consultants for designing and coming up with costs. And again, order of magnitude class D, as well as operational costs, because operational costs are, of course, very closely tied to building design and what amenities are in a building. And so it's really just about that particular part at this point. Yep. Sort of 3.3, I think, on page 9.
So just again, asking Wendy, so we've jumped over the previous motion, and are we including that in the deferral to the next board meeting? Is that, did I miss that? Okay, sorry, I didn't know that was in that motion, sorry. Okay, so on this one, any other questions? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. And our reading person.
Unmute myself before I start reading. That the Alberni Valley and Bamfield Services Committee recommend that the Board of Directors direct staff to undertake the process to secure a consultant to proceed with community engagement.
And a seconder from Director Shannon. Second, she's quick. I see her with a gun. Okay, any comment on this? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Okay, we're getting any late business. Question period. Anybody from the public? We don't have anybody from the public specifically. Have you got any questions? Either
Mr. Chair, there was somebody, there was one attendee, but they're no longer with us.
Okay.
Yeah,
That was me.
I think there was one other besides Director Jack. And Director Jack, there was a chat that you wanted to say something?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I did already.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so there's no more attendees, and there was no emails or submissions received respecting the agenda today.
Okay, would Chief Councillor Lauder or Watts like to give any closing remarks? No. All righty.
For me, no. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks for coming. I appreciate it very much. Okay, so that's it. Motion to adjourn. Mover is Director Paulson and Director Bodner second, and all in favor? Opposed? 6 of you want to stay? My God. Okay, thank you very much.